I've seen black horses outside my doorway. I've seen bright spirits ride on the air. I've seen my true love out in the garden. I've seen my true love standing there. And when I see her, a tear falls from me to think she loved me. My heart's delight. I cannot hold her or follow after. So fierce her beauty, so strange and bright. And when the spirit has left my body, and when they've laid me dead in the ground, there is no maker can shake love from me. My soul will wander till she is found. I've seen black horses outside my doorway. I've seen bright spirits ride on the air. I've seen my true love out in the garden. I've seen my true love standing there. I've seen my true love standing there.
October 13th, 1990. I was 18 years old and still in bed, sleeping off the night before. The landline rang. There was only landlines in those days. It's 9:32 a.m. It was my boyfriend's mother. I knew something was wrong. She proceeded to tell me that she was at the hairdresser's and everyone was talking about a young girl from Marion Avenue in Blackrock, just like me, who had died the night before in an accident outside UCD. "Thank God you're okay," she said. Before I had a chance to put down the receiver, my mind was already racing. Who was it? Immediately I thought of my friend Julie and her pal Jean, both studying in UCD, and I somehow knew. Seconds later, the phone rang again. It was my friend Dara. "Did you hear?" she asked me. "Is it Julie or Jean?" "Julie," she confirmed. My heart sank and my body collapsed. My friend Julie was dead. I remember walking up Booterstown Avenue after Julie's funeral with a few school friends. I was in a daze. This was outside my experience. I had a map of grief. It wasn't my first significant loss, but this was a different feeling. It was out of the order of things, and it was shocking. Out of nowhere and beyond my control, a piercing wail emerged from the depths of me and began to fill the space around me. Startled and concerned, the other girls turned towards me, terror in their eyes. I too was startled and concerned, but that was quickly replaced with horror and shame for having exposed such vulnerability. I stuffed that wail back in where it came from, and I made sure that it never emerged again. At that young age, I knew the societal rules of staying strong, being brave, and keeping it together. I would, of course, pay the price for this later, and in the years that followed, found various addictions to be a wonderful anesthetic for unexpressed grief. A few weeks after Julie died, we heard that her closest friend Jean was pregnant, and after 8 months or so, went on to deliver a baby girl, and then another one, a surprise twin. Jean named the girls Julie and Branwen. This is them today. And Branwen, where are you? You've just heard Branwen singing this evening, so Branwen, thank you for opening us. Grief is all around us at all times. We all have a story of loss. Most of us are the bereaved, unless we've somehow dodged that bullet. Sincere thanks to all of you who are here this evening to launch Shapes of Grief. Those of you who are here with us in Greystones, and those of you who are tuning in online around the globe. Give them a wave. I'd like to acknowledge the staff here from the Irish Hospice Foundation and also from Social Entrepreneurs Ireland. Last year, Shapes of Grief won Social Entrepreneurs Ireland Impact Award, which has made tonight possible. So thank you, Tim and Sophie. I know almost every face here, and so many of you have helped Shapes of Grief be the success that it is, through your support, advice, and encouragement. Thank you to all of you. People often say to me, I love the name Shapes of Grief. How did you come up with that? Well, my goal with Shapes of Grief was to broaden people's awareness of the types of loss that we experience that can cause us to experience deep emotional pain or grief. We grieve, obviously, when someone that we love dies. This is my lovely dad, who died exactly a year ago in March 2021. But we also grieve for so much more over the course of our lifetimes. We grieve the relationships that don't work out, the babies that aren't conceived, the animals we love and lose, the health we assumed we'd have but don't. We grieve the unfulfilled dreams, the childhoods marred by alcoholism or abuse, our wombs after hysterectomy, our breasts after mastectomy. We grieve the opportunities washed away as a result of the pandemic, our identities after redundancy or retirement. We grieve as we witness the destruction of our beautiful planet, and we grieve for our fellow humans whose lives are destroyed in war-torn countries around the globe. As Dr. Pauline Boss says, with grief, there isn't always a hearse. To reduce grief to a few days or weeks following a death is so far from its ubiquitous and lingering truth. We need to understand that we all carry a greater or lesser burden of grief throughout our lives, yet this is poorly understood in a grief-illiterate society. This can cause loneliness, suffering, ill health, and sometimes even death. The aim of the Shapes of Grief podcast has always been to shine a light on the many different shapes of grief, as well as to provide a platform for people who are grieving to share their experience and thus reduce the isolation of grief for both themselves and the listeners. Loss simply can't be faced alone. Many of us try, but fail miserably or have poor outcomes. Loss requires acknowledgement, and grief needs to be witnessed and supported. It takes a village to raise a human, and it also takes a village to grieve a human. In sharing our stories with each other, we slowly begin to normalize grief as part of our common human experience, and one by one offer hope and possibilities for the future, that we can survive our losses and we maybe even can find a way to live with loss that could be fulfilling, enriching, and possibly even joyful again, even though life may forever have a different shape. Tonight, through poetry, song, dance, and words, we're going to explore some of the possible landscapes of loss from a variety of different perspectives. We would also like to signpost those of you who want to understand what is needed to professionally support those who are grieving and offer you some next steps for your personal and professional journeys. We will show you where you can find the right information and knowledge that you need to become more at ease with people who are grieving. We want to strive to be the friends, family members, or professionals who ease the experience of grief and not the ones who make it worse. As a matter of urgency, particularly in the wake of the COVID pandemic, we all need to become grief-informed and grief-educated. All of us, not just the professionals. Our messages are grief literacy for all grievers and for those who support them, grief training for all professionals supporting those who grieve, and resulting, hopefully, in a more compassionate world for everyone. This is Niamh Fitzpatrick. We have a change in the programme. Unfortunately, Niamh was very, very sick last night and had to cancel this morning, but I'm delighted to say that Ruth Fitz Morris, at the 11th hour, like Superwoman, has stepped in. And so the day has been saved by Ruth. Thank you very much. Ruth is author of I Found My Tribe, which I'm sure many of you have heard of and indeed read. So I'm going to hand you over to Ruth now, as well as to Ger Murphy and Kathleen Keys. Each of them will share their own unique experience of loss through a selection of their own writing. Some hard themes will be discussed here tonight, so listeners, first and foremost, do take care of yourselves. If you need to pop out to the bathroom, please do that. And remember to breathe. We all need that reminder. So please join me in gently holding their stories of grief here this evening. Kathleen, Ruth, Ger, please come up.
Hello, everyone. I am not Niamh Fitzpatrick. My apologies. It's my real pleasure to be here tonight to support Liz Gleeson and the Shapes of Grief podcast and her grief education programme. Liz is, as you all know, she's just such a good person, and she's a rare person, and that is a powerful mix. So the first piece that I'm going to read tonight is actually one that I wrote for a different grief project called the Good Grief Project. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of them, but there's a dynamic husband and wife team called Jane Harris and Jimmy Edwards, who are also friends of Liz's. And they do great work making films and running retreats to help people with their grief, all inspired by the sudden death of their own son, Josh. So, yeah, they asked me to write a piece about grief, and I wrote this, when did I write this? Kind of in the middle of COVID. They just said the brief really was just tell us about your grief, and so this is what I wrote. Okay. When I miss my brother John in the mornings, I eat marmalade toast. It makes me feel better. John loved marmalade. He was a proper, mindful Paddington Bear. In 2019, age 46, within a year and a half of his diagnosis, John died of a fast-growing, aggressive brain tumour. 2 years before that, in 2017, my husband Simon died from motor neuron disease at the age of 43. He lived with MND for 9 years and could not move or breathe for most of it. These are the facts as they happened. The above litany of loss gives me every reason to look for sympathy, remain broken and miserable, or feel robbed and landed with a raw deal. What if I told you I feel lucky and blessed? Not that they died, but for the lessons so much loss has gifted me. You might wonder if I am a Jesus freak, or a kook, or a liar, or trying to promote some kind of new fad yoga practice or energy drink. Tell me to get lost. I might do the same had I not been through it myself. I am less cynical. I am lucky. When we drive by the ocean and streaks of sunlight spill through the clouds in every direction, I call them God's fingers and shout, "Look," to my 5 children. Dada is saying hello. We hug trees when they miss him because he loved forests. We eat Jaffa cakes on his birthday, and they beg me to tell them again and again how he could eat a whole pack at a time without stopping. His legacy lingers in the fabric of our daily lives, in the particular way my son bites his tongue when concentrating, or the blue shape of my daughter's eyes, in our unhealthy love of Jaffa cakes. Why am I lucky? Because loss woke me up to the fact I am alive at all. For months after he died, my husband lived in our floor-to-ceiling bookshelves he had loved and built in our kitchen. Here, I could talk to him directly, between remembered poems, scraps of paper, and spidering handwriting scrawled in book margins. Most days I would say, "Simon, give me something," then glean the book spines and choose one jutting out further than the rest. Often we still talk to each other this way. Simon lived with M&D for almost a decade. He was a powerful flame, extinguished by degrees, by ventilators, by round-the-clock nurses, eye-gaze technology, and a computerized voice. This prolonged loss was too much, and it brought me to nature. I took up sea swimming and plunged myself year-round in the freezing Irish Sea, ridding my mind of the painful chatter. Sea swimming lifted the daily sadness from my bones. I emerged every day lighter, a clean slate, until the very next day, sadness weighed me down again. You can embrace the seasons, make your peace with the life-death life cycle, grapple with acceptance, but to experience such active loss is debilitating. The body experiences trauma, and it doesn't forget. Grief takes you down and immobilizes you. It leaves you with very large, visible holes. What is needed then is a full keening, a wailing and gnashing of teeth, an existential scream that shakes the world. This is what is supposed to happen, if you have ever loved at all. Swimming stopped the grief chatter. It emptied my head as I begged the cold ocean for that elusive thing called ease and long-forgotten silences. With a clear head, that's when it happened. Among the waves, along the shore, between treasure pockets of glinting sea glass, flocks of birds swooping overhead, and glimpses of the fleeting sunrise, I heard the beautiful sounds and rhythms of nature. It was nothing less than the music of my own soul. Grief was a rude awakening. It woke me to the fact I have a soul at all. A soul is harder to ignore when it is screaming. There is nothing pleasant about it, but you gain a new alertness. A soul in pain is a soul that has woken up. It is not for the faint-hearted. I discovered that my heart is huge and my love infinite. It stirred up my creative energy because I had no choice but to write my way out of this. I wrote like a maniac and realized my words had a beat to them too, much like a song. The soul is our own inner landscape, and its natural rhythms are musical and breathtaking as the biggest view. I am my words and my soul is me. I swam and wrote about it, and the book took on a life of its own. People listened and could relate. This brought enormous comfort, and my song got stronger. A whole orchestra swelled. What is grief? Only the small matter of finding your soul's song and connecting to others. Only the most intense human experience we can have. In my own small blip of existence, I have learned more about life through walking with death than anything else. Now, each day, I make a promise to my dear departed brother and husband. Life is a precious gift. I promise them I will try to live well. I thank them for the lessons and tell them I miss them. Sometimes I cry, often I swim. None of us will live forever. I hug my children tighter, eat marmalade toast and the odd Jaffa cake, talk to my bookshelf, read poetry, attempt yoga poses, sample the latest energy drink, Continue to create, laugh, and sing. In this beautiful life, I walk on with love. That's the first one, and I'm going to have a drink of water. Wow, this is intense. It's a bit like some kind of confessional. So the next one that I'm going to read is from my book, I Found My Tribe, which was published in 2017, which was also the year that Simon died from motor neuron disease. Now, Liz asked me to read this chapter. I've never actually read this chapter before at a reading, because it's really about a bad mood, and I do apologise, it's got lots of bad language in it. It's the thing about when you're in survival mode and in grief, you curse like a sailor. So that's the mood I was in when I wrote this chapter. So this is based, Simon was diagnosed with MND in 2008. By 2010, he was in a wheelchair, but he still had use of his upper body. And we had escaped to Australia. I had dragged him and our 3 little boys over to Australia to hang out with friends. So this chapter is about when we came home from Australia back to Ireland, and things were starting to get very real. I had been a superhero when we were in Australia, kind of a superhero wife / carer, amazing partner. And when we moved back to Greystones, Simon was beginning to deteriorate a lot more, and he was losing a lot more strength. And so it was getting harder to be that superhero / carer, amazing wife. So it's called Kicking Cars. And again, I apologise for the language. See this. What do you do on dark days? MND is like water torture, slowly drip, drip, dripping. A tiny nerve ending, a small piece of strength gets stolen every single day. When superheroes lose their powers, it never ends well. They get dramatically destroyed. I imagine exploding in company. I could self-combust at the supermarket in a fine, sticky mess over mild chats about all the rain we've been having. Why can't I wake up those nerve endings? Shake them back to life. Slap him in the face. Home from Perth, I get so angry. Make it stop. Why can't you make it stop? Stay with us. We love you. We need you. We don't want to be here without you. Then I cry from a very dark place and fall deep. Back in Greystones, there is so much rain. It's hard being back where we lived first married. That life was all cliff walks, coffees, and casual strolls. This place is confusing and cross. I wish that Dada could walk like other Dadas. Jack, my son, wails at 4 years of age. I want to cry forever. Then he makes a good stab at it. I know this cry so well. It's from the deepest place. It stirs you up so you think your insides will spill out. It's a disgusting physical mess of a cry that retches out the darkest parts. It's not fair, he cries, and I know it's not. To see my boy cry like this makes me angry. But not just one boy. 2 tinier hearts weep and roar in the wings, his loyal backup singers. They understand even less, but know for sure that it's shit. What do? You want your head to blow up in bright sparks because that is what it feels should happen. You can't curl into a ball in a dark room because children are crying with empty cups. They are fighting for toast. It has to be you because there's nobody else to do it. And without a superhero suit, you think, what is the point? An angry brain screams fast, angry thoughts. There is no hope for these beautiful boys. They will end up in rehab or drug addicts or on mystery milk cartons because their mother got shouting mad and their father stared at walls from his wheelchair and then he died. Is this where we're going because there's nowhere else to go? His arms will stop working and he won't be able to talk. I will want to die myself because it's too large to bear the weight of it. We will have orphan Oliver Twist children. Oh, please, sir, I want no more. We drive a comical wheelchair car. It's Postman Pat's van painted blue. I drive slowly so Simon doesn't get hurt by the bumps. He sits high in the back while his 3 boys fight and chat in the middle. We all jump at the howl of a car horn. A low green convertible cuts me off at a T-junction. It's just another road rage driver beeping us in traffic. We meet them every day, but today, something breaks. The green beast stops at a red light up ahead, and I pull up behind him. My body goes calm. Back in a second, I bark at the boys. What do you do with the pain when you're world weary and really angry at the same time? I have banged my head against walls. It bled and I saw stars. I have stared at my scrawny arms and imagined red gashes slashing blue veins. I have crumpled to the floor, hiding behind kitchen presses, hugging my knees for dear life. I have drunk and smoked, overeaten, undereaten, all the foods, both good and bad. I have fought shallow breaths till my lungs burst, gasped till I'm numb, laughed till I cried, and cried manic laughing tears. I march up to the driver's window, and a middle-aged man glances out. I was driving slowly because my husband is in a wheelchair, I shout. Maybe you didn't see the big wheelchair sticker? He waves me away and puts up the window. You're a very rude man, I shout, more loudly this time. He won't look at me, and I decide to kick the shit out of his car. I keep kicking and kicking until the light goes green and he speeds off again. I am breathing heavily but feel amazingly calm. An onlooker on the footpath waves, cheers, and gives me the thumbs up. Angry tears have drowned me in dark pits. Buried in fits of black panic, there is no starry sky. I have picked my nails raw and bitten my hand so hard it broke skin, leaving toothy scar smiles. I have done all this, and yet I am still here. I have never fully broken. Our dark world now fills me with the urge to break stuff. I want to break everything and just smash this shit up. Returning to our postman Pat van, I click quietly into my seatbelt. The boys sit up with open mouths. Mama, what did you do that for? Asks Jack. Sorry, love, I reply. That man was just a fucking asshole. I still feel calm, but my hands are shaking so badly I can barely turn the ignition. You said the F word, Jack says in delight. Yep, your mama most definitely said the F word, says Simon, and we laugh as the ignition key finally turns. The engine revs, a mighty Postman Pat roar. Momentarily, this destroyed superhero feels remarkably fine. One more water. Need a breather between those anyway, so I'll just sip some water. Whew, okay, last one. So this last piece I wrote this morning after the school run. And after I got a panicked phone call from Liz saying, oh my God, Niamh Fitzpatrick is sick, and that she had to cancel and could I speak? And I just said, oh God, Liz, but I'll have to get a blow dry. That stayed to me. So Liz very kindly booked the hairdressers for me. And so here I am with far better hair than I had this morning. So thank you, Liz. I'm always happy to help Liz because Liz was a wonderful help to me back when Simon died, and one of my boys particularly completely just switched off from grief, and she recommended a play therapist who quite literally switched him back on again, and now he is a happy boy full of light, and so I'm eternally grateful. So I would probably walk over hot coals for Liz, or certainly do anything for her last minute. So what is this about? Yeah, so I wrote this morning, and it's actually about a coffee I had with a friend yesterday, which was my birthday, and it was just sort of like, it's very short, but it's just teasing out some feelings that I had yesterday. Obviously, Niamh Fitzpatrick is a qualified psychologist, and I'm not, so instead you get my kind of pseudo-psychological ramblings or just my, thinking, thoughts on feelings just put into words. So this is what I wrote. Oh, it's called Life Hack. Did I say that? Yeah, here we go. See it. A good friend of mine whose wife died in this January, said a funny thing to me yesterday over coffee. Talking with you like this is my own personal life hack on how to manage the grief process, he said. Now, I don't know if there are any life hacks for grief or that grief is something to be managed. Management suggests we are in control of anything at all, when grief, I have found, is a curious process of letting go. And who the hell wants to be a grief expert? Not me. I don't know if anyone sets out to be that. Often the process of living has different plans for us than the ones we expect. I do know that when my friend and I sit together over coffee, wishing it was wine, there is a knowingness that passes between us, a relief on both sides that the other person understands. To sit in that space of understanding creates unexpected healing. Healing of the unexpected kind, in my experience, is the most magical of all. The sheer surprise gift of it gives you hope. So who between us is really getting the life hack? Him, the one new to this, recently bereaved, still reeling, left blinking in the harsh sunlight, or me, the weary seasoned traveller, the one accustomed to facing the sun? The truth is, of course, as we talked about everything and nothing, invisible threads passed between us, and for a tiny moment, it all made sense. I understood everything, life, death, the universe. Then, just as quickly, I forgot. Life remains a mystery as layer after layer, two slightly broken, grieving, impermanent humans, neither devils nor angels, both just alive and inherently flawed, continue to grow, unravel some more, and learn by letting go. Maybe the next time we talk, we'll both remember again. Sitting in that knowingness, so very glad that another human understands. And that's it. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, thank you. So, I'm Ger Murphy, and I have been working as a psychotherapist for the last 35 years or so. I write some poems, but more to the point this evening, I've been in a relationship with sorrow and loss with over 55 years. And I guess like any relationship, it has its seasons, it has its various temperatures in it. There have been times in that relationship for me where there's been much more about denial and numbness. There's been times when there's been an aggressive avoidance and working with any substance or any other activity to keep it down. And latterly, I suppose, as I've matured a little bit more, there is a kind of hospitality to my grief, to my sorrow. And that kind of hospitality has allowed me to see it as something that I can be in a relationship with, rather than something that I want to get finished. Like this idea of closure. I mean, it's great for wardrobes, I think, but actually, it's probably not a great idea. It's because there's such a loss in that if we close it and push it away. To me, it's an ongoing relationship that allows me live with a broken heart, and that to actually make a place for death and for loss in my life. I mean, I'm standing here right now, and I can feel the heartbeat in my throat, and I know that sturdy heart, just as you may hear your own heartbeat right now, will someday stop for all of us. And living with the truth of that, not as a morose kind of obsession, but living with the truth of that allows me to live with a lot more joy in different ways. I want to offer you 3 poems. The first poem relates to the death of my father, Matt Murphy, and I found him dead one night, in the middle of the night, when I was 9 years old. And I think the effect of that was a severe, traumatized, frozen experience in myself. I remember myself in the funeral car on the following day, And all my I was the youngest of 5, and all my siblings and my mum, everybody was crying. And I remember feeling such shame that I could have no tears. And it was like, it was something that went in very strongly in me. So the first poem is called The Kiss. There are 3 references. I'm sure some of you have your Irish, but some may not. There are 3 references in this poem in Irish, which I'll just describe to you. First one is ag dul isteach, which is simply going in. Amach is out. And galore, Tommy galore, is I am enough. The kiss of my father's shock is bringing me all the way home. Ag dul isteach, layer by layer, slate by shale, mining the difference towards the core, opening the door, finding his body dead on the floor. Amach, no more. Lava hardens quickly, brittle, so fast gone. Was it he or I grew cold more quickly? You don't have to die for rigor mortis to set in. I was afraid to touch, afraid I'd be entombed forever. And I was, a little boy in slate and shale. Now bringing air to relic is holy work. Ag dul isteach, making room for sorrow and loss. Tommy galore, my mother tongue, company on the road home. So that poem for me speaks about the huge traumatic freezing that can happen with death and with shock like that. The second poem I want to read, I'm going to read the second one. Second poem I want to read relates to the death of my brother. Going back to that house, to my house of upbringing 20 years later, when my brother Pat had just killed himself, and coming back to find him there. I want to read that. And this speaks to me of another aspect of my grieving around the long road it can take to find acceptance of what is, acceptance of what has happened. Yes to you. When I saw you after it was over, they had put rouge on your cheeks, something you had never wore before. I came through the door in my pink jeans. We both looked ready for some strange party. I drank half a large bottle of whiskey, but to no effect. This was no party. Rouge, pink jeans, and whiskey, markers only to the madness of that day in May. You had decided not to stay. And the echoes sound on like her little head banging in rhythm against her cot all through the night. Horror has no speech but the inarticulate pounding of real. It takes so long to feel, to lay the wound open, to bathe the bruises like those we never got to bathe around your sweet neck, where the rope bit deep and no rouge could hide. Now our rouge, pink jeans, and whiskey can drop away today to honor you in horror. No longer pity you, and as my pity slips, so do my bandages, my cover. I exchange my exotic other for homespun horror. I see you now on your makeshift pyre, making your final desperate statement, like so many before on their crosses. And I say what it has taken 30 years to say yes to you, my brother. And the final poem is, to me, speaks of the value of grief and the value of grief in my own life to open me to the wider griefs, to the griefs that are in the whole society, the griefs that are in the world right now. For example, the grief around climate change, and the importance of me being able to find that place where I can grieve. And this is a poem called The Black Cloud of Despair. And this should come up on video here. The black cloud of despair sits on the dark lake of early morning. The acid rain cries across the valley. And we see what we have done, squandered our inheritance. Almost too breathtaking to look upon this scene of soil, water, strange colour, unfamiliar to the land. But look upon it we must, to break this spell of ignoring. And cry, 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 first from deep inside, then rising to cleanse us of our shame and opening us in humility. And the tear of first drop of cleaner water that begins to cleanse the land. Thank you.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks. Hello everyone. I'm Kathleen Keys, and I'm here this evening to read, because I was invited to read by Liz Gleeson. Thank you, Liz. I'm here for Grania, Fergal and Dara, my 3 beautiful children that I brought into the world. I was lucky enough to be chosen by them to be their mother, and turned out they had an illness, cystic fibrosis, and we had a wonderful life. And all I can do is smile, because when I think about them, you know, they're so bright and clever and witty and funny, musical. They're very creative. We're very close. Didn't take life too seriously at all. They were always battering around the house and having great fun, and they were into all kinds of things. Dara was a great filmmaker. Fergal, musician. They were both musicians. Grania was into a lot of drama and playing the drums and stuff. So it was a mad, wild house, and it was full of openness, and they were allowed to be who they wanted to be. They're great friends. I still have all those friends coming to my empty house now, because I live on my own, and I don't want to feel as if I'm feeling sorry for myself, because they're still there with me. I feel them very close to my bones. I see them, you know, when I'm sleeping, and I see a lot of things that reminds me of them. They send me a lot of messages as well from the other world. I can manifest through that. I see their faces every night in my sleep, and it's just magical. It's gorgeous. I'm very lucky because I have an open door to where they are and them to me. When Grania died at 15 and a half, our lives ended, effectively. Her 2 brothers, Fergal and Dara, were with me, and we had to sit down at the table and eat, and we had only, 3 knives and forks. Before that, we had 4. Before that, we had 5, actually, when their dad was at the house. And then it was down to 4, and then Grania died, so we had to live without her. And there were so many physical parts to that. So much bloody pain, so much pain in your body. Physical, you couldn't sleep. They were crying. You know, I was rubbing their heads at night, hugging them. Dara in particular, because he was very young. He was only about 8. Was he 8 or 10 when Grania died? They were stuck together. She was the oldest and he was the youngest. Fergal was in the middle. So they both carried the same illness in their bodies that she had. So they knew she died. That's a fact. That's a bit of a fact when you're 14. Fergal was 14. Dara was 8. So we had to swallow that up and get on with living. And I used to walk every day on Greystones walk when I dropped the boys to school, and I'd pick flowers and lovely wildflowers, because Grania was wild. She had a head of curls. And I used to have the dog, Breffney, with me. She was a border collie. I'd pick the flowers and come home, and I'd go to the cemetery and I'd spread them there on her bed. And then I'd come home to the house and I'd have to do whatever I was doing, whatever kind of grieving I was going to do, or screaming or shouting or gnashing my teeth, before they came home. So it was important that I got my own time then, so I could be at the school gate and have a motherly look on my face and a smile, and, you know, dust myself down and clean my tears. So what I used to do is I'd come in and I'd have a cup of tea, slice of brown bread, and I'd sit at the table and my heart would be like banging, because I knew I was going to be crying soon. And I'd take out Grania's beautiful picture and put it in front of me. I'd take a sheet of paper and I'd pull in the chair, and that's when I thought I might die, because I'd look straight into her eyes. And I knew that this was difficult, but I could feel all the tears coming up, and then I'd wail. And when the wailing was done and all the paper was wet from tears, I would take up my pen and I'd write. And that's how I started to speak to her, speak to me, speak to the world about how I was, this awful body I was living in now, this world. And so that's what I did, and that was the start of all these letters that I began to write. And I'd be profoundly exhausted by the time I got to the school gate, but that didn't matter, because I could bring the boys home and then I could lie down and look up at the roof and know that something had happened within me. Something had shown itself, or I gave a call out there to somebody, to her, to me. And this was all rustling grief. It was what I call kind of the necessary violence of grief. Because grief is violent. And if you don't look in the eye of grief and say, I can see your violence, and it's okay, I'm here, I can watch you, then you've started something rustling, and something becomes alive, something, you're standing with it. I've written books of letters, and 10 years after that, I had 2 beautiful boys, and I lost another child to cystic fibrosis. I lost the baby, I lost Dara. He was 19 3/4, he was on the cusp of manhood. Beautiful, pale, dark skin, gorgeous, incredible guitar player. He died, and he was gone, and it started again. If it hadn't ever finished, it started again. And so this circle was going on. Somebody talked about a circle a while ago. The circle is going around and around and around. The circles, I think it was Ruth who said something about circles within us that are alive, and they're bubbling up, and you're going round and round and round, and you're telling yourself it has happened, and you tell and tell and tell and tell and tell and tell and tell. And that circle never ended, because it began again. And the letters started. And the hearts were broken, and my little boy was gone. And then my wonderful man who had to live on, my other son, Fergal, would look at me and I'd look at him, and we knew each other. We didn't have to speak. It was all there. And the bacteria that Grania picked up in the hospital many years before was transferred to the two of them. We all lived in the one house. We would have had to live in 3 houses for that not to happen. I feel robbed. Fergal was very healthy, but his lungs wore down. And he was so strong. So tonight I'm going to read a letter that one of the letters I wrote to Grania. I love you, Grania. Love you. Dara, I love you, Fergal. My arms are going round you. I've spent more time talking, I think, with this introduction than I expected. I didn't prepare anything, so I'll read this. Letter to Grania. She was dead about 4 months. It's Tuesday, the 10th of June, 2003. My dear Grania, it's raining and the summer has turned cold. Fergal is well into his junior cert now. Don't know if I talked to you about this in my last letter, and the well of emotions stirred up. My first baby to sit the exam, any exam of that standard. It's not that I care about exams, I don't. It's just that I hoped that you would walk that ground first. But you never reached it, metaphorically speaking. Of course, your ground could never be measured in its expanse and richness in a life of 15.5 precious years. Always I want to go back to where you were, like putting a heavy hand on life to control it, perchance to stop it moving ahead for fear of losing where life was when you stopped being in it. I am dislocated. Half of me there holding your life in my hand, the other half sinking in mist, catching your delightful spirit in flight. How dearly I wish to be with you, my love. I know I am with you, but in my flesh I feel so sorry. In the flesh of my heart, the flesh of my soul. When the days are long and the sun is shining, I would prefer to be anywhere else. Living it out in this way is the only way to go. There is no other way, no other towns or countries or continents. I love the short days of cover when the rain is falling or when the snow is coming down. Still, I would prefer to be anywhere else. Nowhere to go except live this life out where you are. The turmoil, the hell of being in an empty space. Silence, nothing to do. Nobody there to do it with. A room can be an empty space without the one you love in it. It can become a different room. Every room in our house has become a different room without you. We have become different people, living in different rooms. Do I sound self-piteous, Grania? Slap my knuckles if I do. But things do feel different, believe me. You are part of the furniture here, especially the kitchen table, exactly where I'm sitting now, in your place. The holy ground where you laughed, where you talked, joked, drank lots of tea, slogged through your homework, ate your favourite food, laid your curls down for a nap in the afternoon, picked different biros between your slender fingers from the friend's pencil case in that easy, intelligent way of yours, writing purposefully, your head down in rhythm with the movement of words being written, like a train travelling the line in sureness of its destination, always getting there. Different places where you were, where you are. You, beautiful one, wherever you are, my dear Grania, your loving mother, Mummy. My lips are so dry now. This second piece is to honour. Thank you. Thanks so much. The second piece is a poem for Fergal. Fergal died 3 years ago. He was a man. He was the middle child. Atlas. Atlas for Fergal. I will honour you forever in the morning, when with open eyes I walk the dewy path of frosted light to Egan's ditch. And the sky drops down in rusty lines like swallows round your face. My boots are wet with grass, and a wax jacket hangs heavy on my shoulders, in your tracks. I will walk with you in glassy patches as we crush the earth together in these fields, and our talk will linger in the rushes that tickled on our walk. You are Atlas, holding up the world on bended knee, my world. With Herculean hands you have swapped his fallen sky. In the night above our heads, a host of moon is swooning now, for the quiet world of sound that was silenced when you went. This is a poem for dear Dara, my baby. His first day in school day. For Dara. You are a happy little monk, eyes peeping, milk teeth smiling from under the hood of your tracksuit. Your face is shining from the warm, soapy water I washed you in. A satchel harnessed around your shoulders lovingly. Your tummy, a quiet parcel of breakfast. Softly, I lift you to me, and we cling tight like monkeys till it's time to go. The last poem isn't for the children. It's about a tragedy that happened in our small village in Park Elan, Roscommon. Beautiful young man in his 20s died tragically. This is called Blue Water. No one knew what he was thinking when he dodged us on the road, taking to the fields or hiding himself in bushes like a frightened fox. A young lad with sandy hair who rarely spoke. No one knew what he was thinking when he wandered off in late October, the winter drawing in, and he never telling a soul. They searched into the days, tramping fields and recess in the heavy weather, fretful faces carrying news that he was seen along the railway. They harrowed the thresholds of unseen mists and heather, where dreams take flight. They couldn't leave the day to face the dark, till night became a hanging lamp of divination. They would search the forever earth, but it was the swollen river that took him in his terror.
As you can see, it takes tremendous courage to stand up and share your story of grief. And I'd like to salute the three of you, Ger, Kathleen and Ruth. Thank you so much for sharing with us this evening the depths of your experience. And I want to acknowledge that it also takes tremendous courage to show up and bear witness. So I'd like you to give yourselves a clap also for being here, for holding steady, for being present and breathing. So we're going to shift gears just a little bit. My experience with grief began early on in my life, but my grief education began 8 years ago in the Irish Hospice Foundation when I embarked on the Masters in Bereavement Studies. My work here, Shapes of Grief, stands on the shoulders of many giants, The grief theorists, the researchers who have painstakingly devoted their lives to understanding grief and exploring how to best support the bereaved, as well as the people who've directly educated me, Dr. Susan Delaney here tonight, Orla Keegan here today also. These are two of the giants whose shoulders that I stand on. Orla's going to speak now for the next few minutes, and she's going to put some shape and context onto the concept of grief support. What is grief support? What is our role as professionals, and what is our role as friends and family and community to people who are grieving? So Orla, please come up. Join me in welcoming Orla from the Irish Hospice Foundation. And once again, thank you to Ger, Kathleen and Ruth. And just bear with me 1 minute. Get your slide up.
Thank you, Liz, and particularly thank you, Ruth, thank you, Ger, and thank you, Kathleen. You've done a service, a tremendous service to us here and to people who are listening from whatever perspective they are taking in the audience. Whether they're wearing their bereaved hat, because I believe we're all the bereaved, or whether they're wearing their professional hat. So thank you so much. And thank you, Liz, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to have watched you over the years and your passion and conviction that something needs to give, something needs to change around grief and loss. We need to build space to talk about it and to understand it. As Liz said, I work at the Irish Hospice Foundation, and we do a lot of work around bereavement, not all of it direct service work. We obviously run the MSc, which is an RCSI degree that Liz mentioned, and we do other education and training in bereavement and bereavement care. We also work a lot in that public space of trying to help people talk about grief and bereavement. We have a program about grief in the workplace. People have to live their lives day in, day out in these environments where grief is invisible. So we try and just promote, I suppose, some sensitivity. And we look at, I suppose, as a vision for our organisation, it's that no one should face death or bereavement without the care and the support that they need. And that's laudable, but I think that really nobody knows what they need until they're in that space, until they're facing that grief. And that's what we heard from the three of you earlier. You really find your way. You're letting go into it, taking a long time to meet it, and that's grief, uncharted territory. So, in one way, what I'm doing is we're hearing such deep personal stories there, and at the same time, I'm going to now be talking about, I suppose, a shape, a model for how we might try and build a better country when it comes to death and bereavement. So in a way, it's more abstracted, necessarily so, because it's a model to help us guide community life and professional life. The model, it's a public health one. So you'll see there's a pyramid shape in the middle, and really it's a pyramid that distinguishes between all, some, and few. And I'll be saying that all people who are bereaved have needs, but some of them will have maybe just heightened needs or more complex needs where they need extra help. And then a smaller proportion of people will meet, I suppose, paralysing grief where they really need extra attention and extra help. And our circle around that pyramid is very important, because it's saying that we're not all equal in our grief. We don't meet it in the same way, because we differ on a number of ways. Our circumstances, who we are, our personalities, our life histories, our financial context, and also maybe the circumstances of the death, our deaths. And thank you, each of you, also for noting that when we talk about bereavement, it's rarely the loss of one person. We carry life's loss with us. And that grief experience also varies by time. So those three things come into play when, I suppose, shaping the need that we have. So this model is one that's been developed through a long process with a number of organisations. So the hospice organisations in Ireland, and I see Niamh Finucane here from St. Francis, she was on the team that developed this, but also the HSE and the different voluntary organisations that work in bereavement. I'm just going to walk you relatively quickly through it, because it reflects also what Liz said earlier about having a grief literate society and making sure that people are trained. So when we say all people have needs here in that green space at level 1, we're really saying and acknowledging that you are disconnected. You lose your space in the world when you're bereaved. And really you need the care and the patience of other people. You need folk around you. You need to find your tribe, as Ruth would talk about. But we also have very practical needs. Again, might be needs for finance, help with your bill paying, just help in surviving, practical needs for child pickup, for food, just to keep life going. And sometimes we forget all of that. So that's if that's all of our needs, then it's all of our responsibility to try and help meet those needs. Actually the second level of need, so okay, we're moving, thank you, Liz. The second level of need is really looking at, because of some of the things that are going on for a person, and that could be maybe you just need help to understand. You want to maybe do a program around grief to help you understand what's happening to you. Sometimes people find it difficult to grieve within their own family. We protect each other. So you may want to move out and talk with someone else, perhaps one of those bereavement organisations I mentioned, where you can actually be yourself and have your grief witnessed by somebody who you're not going to add more pain to or more burden to. So that's our sum. And then at the very level 3 and 4, we're talking about people who, because of other challenges in their life, may require professional help, and that would be sort of therapeutic help. So I'm not going to get all technical on it, but what I suppose we're saying is, if this type of variety exists, then there should be the appropriate service in place to meet them. So the further up we go in that pyramid, the more we're getting into formalised services and psychotherapy and counselling. So we want to make sure, looking at this this knowledge and skills part of the pyramid, we want to make sure that the people and the practitioners in those services are well prepared, well resourced, well trained, and able to meet the need of us, the grieving people. So I think looking particularly at that all level, Liz's podcasts are very much engaging with helping us as sisters or as colleagues to understand grief and to be a good support. So we really want more of that public awareness. As we move up the pyramid, the sorts of knowledge and skills that might be needed at level 2, so maybe in in hospitals or in hospice volunteer programs or in the local bereavement support group, we would hope and want that those people had some training in understanding grief. So again, when they're meeting us, they're not prescribing, they're not telling us about stages of grief, which actually don't reflect the grieving experience, again, as all three of you have clearly shown. So we would want to know that people who provide service at level 2 are trained in grief. As we move up, and if you have needs because of your life stresses or because of I suppose the other things that happen to us as well as grief, and you need to maybe talk with a counsellor or a therapist, we want them to be accredited, of course they will, but we also would be calling for them to have extra training and continued professional development in grief and in working with people who have challenges in grieving. So it's into those level 2s and 3s that Liz would be focusing her education programme. And of course there are other programmes, there'll be other CPDs. And I guess looking at our MSc, it would be level 3 into level 4. And what we're encouraging professionals to do is to individually assess, well, what do I need to meet the clients that I'm working with? So part of the purpose of this evening is to raise that awareness. So really, I suppose what we'll just do to end is to say that what we're hoping the model does is that it honours the uniqueness of grief, but that it also provides a plan or a blueprint as to how we as communities, as professionals, and even as a country, how we can build a more caring and a more compassionate space. And we use this to advocate for the allocation of resources, for example. Mental health is the most under-resourced part of the health service, so we would try collectively to use something like that to advocate for resources as well. So that's our model, and it's into that Liz is going to be launching her Shapes of Grief programme. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you so much for that.
So Bronwyn is now going to take to the stage again to bring us a piece just before the interval. Unfortunately, this is a secret piece and it can only be played here tonight. So I'm really sorry to the people who are watching on YouTube and Facebook. There's 60 or 70 of people logging into the live stream, which is wonderful. I'm sorry you can't see the next piece, but we'll be playing some videos for you. And for those of you watching online, we'll be back with you in about 25 minutes. And for those of you here, after Bronwyn's piece, we will take a 20-minute interval. You're invited to shake your bodies, breathe deeply, have a drink, have chats with each other. Please keep an eye out on the people who might be here on their own and have a little chat with them. I know so many of you here tonight, and I know that so many of you carry a story of grief. So, just maybe look out for each other at the interval. And like Orla said, let's start with that compassionate society right here today. So thank you, Bronwyn and Marion. Bronwyn and Marion are part of my Earth Song family. I go camping every year, so I know them from a field down in Cahir, Tipperary. And when I had a vision for this evening, I knew I wanted a singer and a dancer, and they were the first two that came to mind. We're going to move on now. I'm going to introduce you to our next speaker. Some of you have met her at the break, Dr. Katherine Manx. Katherine took early retirement after 30 happy years as a palliative care specialist doctor to work towards better public understanding of dying. Since then, she's written 2 books, appeared on TV and radio around the world. She's a Ray D'Arcy regular. And she's travelled the world to speak at medical conferences, book festivals, and events just like this. Her first book, With the End in Mind, has been translated into 16 languages so far, and it's been shortlisted for the Wellcome Book Prize. She tells me she's still getting over the surprise of that. But for those of us who've read her book, it's no surprise. Katherine is a dear friend of Shapes of Grief. Any of you who listen to the podcast will have heard perhaps one of the 3 episodes that she's very generously done with me for the podcast. And we're delighted to welcome you here tonight, Katherine. So please join me in giving Katherine a round of applause.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for everybody who's bought a book so far. There are a few left. It was all a terrible mistake. I didn't mean to write a book. I just thought I was going to write some newspaper articles and then have a nice quiet retirement. But you know, sometimes you see a storm on the horizon and you're not quite sure what's going to happen next. I only wanted to tell one story. I wanted to tell the story that my grandma understood by having lived through the deaths of siblings, her husband, one of her children, her parents, because she was born in 1900 with a life expectancy of around 50 years if you were a female infant born in the wrong end of Liverpool in 1900. And so by the mid-1930s, she'd seen people dying. She understood what dying was about. When she was 48, which was in 1948, the National Health Service in the UK started, and life expectancy started to rise. And a really surprising thing happened to her that she discussed with me when I was a new consultant in 1995 or 1996. Now, the mathematicians amongst you will have realized that she'd outlived her life expectancy almost by twice. And the thing that was worrying her was that now that she was in her late 90s and probably going to die at some point, that her children had never seen somebody die. And what would they make of that? And it occurred to me for the first time that the loss of understanding of ordinary dying, the loss of that wisdom, happened over a single generation, which is my parents' generation. And that will have happened in Ireland in parallel. So although we remained in touch with death and the ceremonies after death, we became less and less familiar with ordinary dying because it was happening in hospital, and it was happening in an attempt to prevent dying, which, if you caught people early enough with reversible illnesses, was successful. So dying in hospital became a little bit shameful, a little bit of a failure, a thing that we didn't talk about. So there I was at medical school learning how to save lives, coming from a generation of people who didn't understand dying, and then I got sent out into hospitals to save lives. But I wanted to be a cancer specialist, so I worked on cancer wards and leukemia wards, and people died because the treatments were not nearly as successful as they are now. And eventually, when I moved sideways to work in a hospice, I was invited by my boss to come and talk with him to a lady who was very, very afraid of what was going to happen to her as she died. And the thing that she was afraid of was being overwhelmed by pain as she died, because that's what happens on soap operas. That's what happens in the cinema. That's what you read about in the newspapers. So he said to me, come with me, I'm going to go and talk to this lady. And I didn't know why he was taking me with him, because I knew people didn't die in overwhelming pain, and I knew quite a lot about pain control, because I was probably in my late 20s, you know, that age when you know everything. So he took me along to talk to this lady who actually was French, and she'd come to England after the Second World War because she'd married the British airman who'd parachuted into France to help her French resistance cell to build radios. And as an elderly lady now, a widow, she'd taken to wearing a little rosette ribbon on her nightdress, which was red and black, and I didn't know what it meant. But my boss's father had the same ribbon because he also had been a hero of the resistance, and he knew what it meant, and he knew that this was a very brave woman. And because he was fluently bilingual, very often they conversed in French in the evenings, and usually when that happened, we lesser beings, you know, the nurses and I, we'd be watching them, and we could see she was flirting with him. So we arrived, and she patted the bed where he was to sit and sparkled at him, and I sat on a little stool, and he launched into talking to her in a very familiar way because he knew her very well. He said, "I heard that you're really frightened of dying in overwhelming pain." And I'm sitting on my stool thinking, that's not the way I would have started this conversation. That's a bit awkward. And she said, yes. And he said, would you like to tell me a little bit about that? And she explained that if she were to die in overwhelming pain, she might despair. And if she were to despair, because she was a French pre-Vatican Council II Roman Catholic, that would be a sin, a mortal sin. And if she died in a state of mortal sin, she couldn't go to heaven. And because her husband had died a few years ago of a heart attack, and a few hours before he died, he'd been awake saying all the prayers with the priest. He was very brave. He had great faith. She was sure he was in heaven, and so they would be parted for eternity. This was actually not about pain at all. This was existential distress. And I wondered what my boss was going to say about it, and I was pretty horrified when what he said was, I wonder if it would help you if I described to you what happens as people are dying. You what now? How can you possibly describe that? I've seen several hundred people die by now because I've been a junior doctor. I've been at the pointy end of medicine. I've been in the emergency room. I've been alongside my cancer patients when they've been dying. How can he explain what dying is going to be like? But she trusted him, and she said, yes, I'd like to know. And so he began to describe to her what we see as people are dying. And he said, you know, it's really interesting that as people come to the end of their lives, it doesn't really matter what the illness is. The pathway is very similar. They feel more tired. They run out of energy more easily. They become more weary. And I'm thinking, okay, that's not so bad. And I recognize that that is true from the people that I've seen over the years in outpatients, gradually being less energetic. And he said, you know, I can go on and describe the process, but I would like you to promise me you'll stop me if I go too far, if I tell you too much. And she said, yes, I'll stop you if I need you to stop. So he said, so as time goes by, what we find these people running out of energy discover is that they need more sleep to recharge their energy batteries. And they gradually sleep more, they're awake less, until eventually they are just awake for short periods of time and asleep for most of the day. And then a really interesting thing happens. And I think, oh, what is he going to say now? He said, some of the time when they look as though they're asleep, something happens like it's medicine time or a visitor comes, there's a phone call, we need to wake them up. We can't wake them up. They're not just asleep, they're unconscious. Do you understand unconscious? Coma, do you want me to say that in French? He says, no, coma, oui, I understand. And I'm sitting on my stool thinking, where's he going next with this? This is really, really uncomfortable. But she is looking at him. She trusts him. She's stroking his hand. And he says, so once people can't reliably wake up at medicine times, we don't want their discomfort to come back. So at that point, maybe we find different ways of giving them their medicines. And then there was a completely unnecessary, I felt, conversation between two people who had French ancestry about the use of suppositories, which I will spare you. And then he explained that usually we use little injections under the skin. We might put the next 24 hours worth of medicines into a little syringe pump that will gradually pump it in so the blood levels stay the same, symptoms don't come back, the person can wake up if they are awake enough, they'll go back into their sleep, into their unconsciousness. The drugs aren't causing the unconsciousness, they're just preventing the distress. And she's starting to sit up more and more, and she's looking, her eyes locked on his eyes. And I'm thinking, this is quite extraordinary, because she's nodding and she is drinking in this information. And he said, so as time goes by, eventually people no longer wake up at all. They are completely unconscious. And when we're completely unconscious, the only bit of our brain that's still working is the bit that drives the breathing. So now it's just automatic breathing cycles, sometimes slow, sometimes fast for a while and then slow again, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow. So if your nieces and nephews are visiting and they see you breathing in a shallow way but quite fast, they might think that maybe you were breathless because they won't have seen this breathing before. And we'll check, but almost certainly it's just this automatic breathing. And sometimes families call us because the breathing is slow and deep and people can't feel their throats anymore, so they don't relax their vocal cords and they might breathe out and make a noise, and the family says, is this person groaning? Is this person trying to speak? And we'll check, but almost always it's simply that they can't feel their throats and they're breathing out in a noisy way. I'm on my stool and I think, okay, he must be finished now. He must be finished now. So at the very end of somebody's life, he says, and I'm thinking, alert, alert, can I get under the bed? Is there a hole in the floor somewhere I could get into? I cannot believe that he's still going. At the very end of somebody's life, he said, their breathing becomes gentler and slower, and there are pauses. And sometime during that slow phase, usually there will be a breath out that just isn't followed by another breath in. It's as simple as that. It's as gentle as that. There's not going to be a rush of pain at the end. There's not going to be a sudden sense of fading away. No panic. Just very, very gentle. And she's sitting up and she's stroking his hands, and she picked up his hands and she kissed them. And then she closed her eyes and she leant back against her pillows, and in her very French way told us that that was enough now. So we walk back up the corridor, and I've got two brains operating at once, one of which is saying, I cannot believe that he has just described dying, and yet I realise I've seen that. I've seen it hundreds of times, but I hadn't realised that there was a pattern because I was the most junior doctor. I was the person who was worrying about this person's oxygen levels and this person's blood levels and this person's potassium levels and this person's kidneys. And I never stood back enough to see this pattern. But as he described it, I understood it, and I understood how many times I'd seen it. He was absolutely describing a truth to her. And he said to me, are you okay? And I said, yes. And he said, do you think we need a cup of tea? And I said, yes. And I went into the kitchen to put the kettle on and do something calming, because what I'd seen was transformational, that we can describe dying. We can describe it with our hands on our hearts and say, this is what people see. This is what we experience. This is what your family will see at the bedside. And provided the symptom management of the illness that the person's dying of is tip-top, then their dying will not be interrupted by physical distress from their illness. And that is a remarkable gift that we can give to people. And that's probably, I think, the second story in With the End in Mind. And the rest of the book is really just that story over and over again, happening to other people. So I wrote that book, and I thought, well, that's going to be an end of it now. I can retire now. And then what happened was I started getting letters. And the letters I got from people said either, this is what I saw, thank you for explaining it to me. I had a letter from a lady who said, I've been in therapy for 5 years since my mother died because I could hear that breathing. I could hear that rattling. I could hear her groaning. I thought she was drowning. I thought she was in enormous distress. And last night I read your story about that French lady, and I slept through the night for the first time in 5 years. Because although she was having help from a highly qualified professional, she clearly was not having help from somebody who understood the process of dying. And all of her PTSD might have been solved at a much earlier phase if not necessarily a therapist, if the lady she chatted to in the greengrocers or a friend she went out with for a cup of tea understood the process and helped to decatastrophize her thinking for her. I had lots and lots of letters from people saying, you've convinced me we need to talk about this stuff, but how do you start? I'm trying to talk to my parents, they keep closing me down. I'm dying, I'm trying to talk to my adult children, they won't have any of it. Mum, just have another round of chemotherapy. Please don't give in. And I'm tired, and I want to stop. Now, it turns out that when you write a book that turns out to be a bestseller, that wasn't a sentence I was ever expecting to say. Your publishers then want another book, and they'd been pushing me for another book, and I didn't think there was another book to write. I'd said what I came to say. But because of these letters, I realized that actually maybe I did have something else to say from my experience of those conversations. And that's what the second book is. And it's about this, that if we call them difficult conversations, if we think about them as challenging, if we think that we're afraid as we go into them, we'll metaphorically put our armor on. We'll get ready to have these conversations. And I've had so many letters from people who think that if I could just give my parents a really good talking to, or if I could just give my children a really good talking to, we could get all of this out in the open and it all would be better. And I think that actually we need to do the opposite of putting our armor on. I think we need to take our armor off and come to each other with tenderness and be prepared to be vulnerable and to give each other a really good listening to. So the new book was called Listen, because that's the thing that matters. And to start off with, I was trying to distill listening skills as a kind of toolkit. And then I realized a toolkit isn't going to work, because with a toolkit, you use one tool, and then you put it down and you pick the next one up to continue the job. But when we're communicating with each other, we're doing lots of things at the same time. We're working together, we're collaborating. And it's much more like a dance. And like a dance, it needs to start not with me coming in and saying to you, this is what we're going to talk about. Today is the day we're going to talk about it. But with me coming to you to say, there's this thing that I really would appreciate if we could talk about together. We both need to be ready. When it suits you, please may we talk about whatever this difficult thing is. Let's name it now, so I'm not worried about naming it anymore. I know that you know that I know that you know that this is the thing we're going to talk about, but you'll decide when. So just like a dance, we're issuing an invitation. We know that bereaved people describe people breaking off eye contact and looking away so they don't have to greet them, crossing the road, changing direction, in order not to have a conversation that they are going to find difficult, hard, not sure what to say. And part of Liz's invitation in Shapes of Grief is that we walk towards each other, that we make that eye contact, that we turn up for each other, even if what we say is, I heard your news and I really don't know what to say. That's okay. Because actually the job is not to make it better. There isn't a way to make it better. What we need to do is listen to people and use our curiosity to understand how things are for them. So just like children who just ask questions, they just ask questions, they just ask questions. And from our answers to the questions, they build up a picture of the world. If we meet people who are dealing with dying and death and grief by being open to listening to them and by asking questions of gentle concern, they will tell us what they want us to know. We might not be the person they want to tell everything to. We need to bring our humility with us. But what will happen is that we will gradually broaden our experience and our understanding of the way that people grieve and what bereavement is about. So what we're doing is using time. This isn't a single conversation. We aren't trying to fix something that's broken. These conversations are part of a process that allows a grieving person to work it out, to look at it from all angles, to be accompanied in their distress. And our job is simply to be there and be their companion, not make suggestions, not tell them what they should be doing, because they will find their own way. One of the most important components of these conversations is silence, because during that silence, the work is happening, the thinking is happening. Silence is where we think things through, silence is where we make our decisions, silence is where we change our minds. And by turning up for our grieving family and friends simply as their family, their supporters, their companions, we will become more familiar with the many different shapes of grief. We will understand what is part of the grieving process from one person to another and what's particular to this individual with this particular loss. And for those of us who work as therapists, we need to bring a proper bereavement-informed, grief-informed training into our therapeutic practice. Otherwise, we're actually letting people down by trying to apply the wrong models or the models we're familiar with in a way that isn't a fit for grief. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm absolutely delighted to support Liz, and I'm really, really glad that we're all here together to do it. Thanks, Liz, for inviting me.
I'd like to ask Lisa MacDonald to come up here. We're going to play a little video. So last year, as I mentioned, Shapes of Grief won an award, the Social Entrepreneurs Award, Social Entrepreneurs Ireland Award. It's called an Impact Award, and I've had mentoring for the last 9 months to help build Shapes of Grief. And this evening was the idea of Sophie. She was like, why don't you hold an event? So it's all your fault, Sophie, that we're all here today. But part of this award was €20,000 to spend as I wished. And this event has largely been funded by the Social Entrepreneurs Ireland Award, Impact Award. And this next piece that you're going to see is one of the first ways that I spent some of the money from Social Entrepreneurs Ireland. I went trawling the internet for somebody with talent who knew something about animation and illustration. And I found Lisa MacDonald, who had just graduated from IADT in Dunleary. And I said, I have this project, will you be part of it? Because I really like your work. And so Lisa and I have worked on producing this next little piece, which will take 2.5 minutes to watch.
Grief. Grief is a normal response to loss of any kind. There are many types of losses and many types of grief. There is no one way to grieve, and everyone grieves differently. Usually, it can be really tough for some time, like you're holding a big weight that you're just not strong enough to carry. Grief can be confusing. One minute you're in floods of tears, the next you're laughing with friends. Sometimes it can feel like your grief is consuming you, or you're drowning in it, or like you've somehow fallen apart. Grief can make you sick in all sorts of ways. It can keep you awake for hours on end. It can be scary, but mostly it can feel very, very lonely. Sometimes you just want your grief to go away, and you long for your old life to come back again. Often, people just don't understand, saying things like, "Well, you look great. You're so strong. You've got an angel in heaven now." Oh. And we can feel let down. In time, we learn that grief doesn't shrink or go away. We just learn to live with it. We slowly adapt to our loss and grow around our grief. The grief remains the same, but we change. Slowly, bubbles of life begin to come back, and we find new ways of continuing a bond with our loved ones. Time alone doesn't change grief. It's what we do with our time that matters. Our evolving understanding of grief has changed how we provide support. There really are no defined stages. If you are professionally working with people who are grieving, sign up today for the award-winning Shapes of Grief program on shapesofgrief.com. And even if you're not a professional, but know someone grieving or caring for someone who is, know that our website has resources for you too. Because grief and good grief support are everyone's business.
Lisa doesn't know I'm going to ask her this, but would you say a word or two about the process of doing that, Lisa?
Yeah, for sure. Completely put me on the spot here now.
I totally have.
But no, I suppose one thing I have to say, especially after listening to everybody that's spoken thus far, is that I am not blessed so much with the gift of age just yet, but so I don't really understand what it is to grieve fully. I only know by watching those who've grieved before me and all that. But I suppose this experience has done is that it's opened my mind to perhaps being prepared for things like this to happen, because things do happen every day, you know. And to have this kind of education put forward for everybody, I think it's just a great way to start a conversation and perhaps move forward to a better way of thinking. And I think in the long run, it will make everybody healthier, you know. Better way to deal with everything. So thank you very much for having me involved, Liz. It's been great.
Didn't she do an amazing job?
Thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Scamper away.
And just a shout out to Sinead sitting over there. Sinead, I don't know if you can stand up and make yourself seen. Sinead did the voiceover, so big thanks, Sinead, and big thanks, Lisa. You did an absolutely amazing job. Lisa had never actually done anything like this before. No. And it was a massive project, and I pushed her and pushed her and pushed her. And actually, I think this video, I'm going to be asking you all to share the hell out of it. I think this video is going to go really far, and it's going to do a lot of good. You know, there isn't a stage of grief mentioned there, and some of the other theories are there, which is really important. So people will probably not watch the playback of tonight. It'll be 2.5 hours long, but they might watch this. So it's all about just putting drops in, and every drop will create a ripple, which will do something somewhere for someone. So thank you, Lisa. Well done.
Very much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you so much for your presence this evening. We're not finished yet, but we are on the last lap. We're way over time as well, so thanks for sticking it out, both online and here in person. I'm going to just tell another little story. And before I do that, I just want to mention actually those bubbles of life. Did you notice that part in the animation? And that idea came from a client of mine who I bumped into in Woody's. And it was a couple of years after her daughter had died. And I met her and we had a chat beside the paint, and I said, "How are you doing now?" And she thought about it for a while, and she looked up, and then she said, she put her hand in her chest like this. People who are grieving will often say, I'm so tight here. It's in my body and I'm so tight. So this woman put her hand in her chest and she said, it's like there's little bubbles of life starting to come back. And I think it's so important that tonight, as well as seeing the depth of grief that people can experience, that there's hope. We can survive this. So I just wanted to share that if you're watching that video again. You know, do look towards those bubbles of life, because that's what keeps us going. So it's March 2020, and just as the world goes into lockdown, a woman's husband is diagnosed with leukemia. He becomes very ill very quickly, and he's admitted to hospital. He spends the next 6 weeks there. Home alone with her 4 young children, she assumes that his illness will be treated and he'll be back with them before long. Together, they'll face whatever the future holds. She's barely seen him in person for 6 weeks since his diagnosis. It's still lockdown. He isn't allowed to have visitors, and just daily check-ins on the iPad when her grief allows. When time allows. The disease has spread and it's untreatable. And one morning, without warning, she receives the shocking news that he will die in the coming days. Something similar to an explosion goes off in her head, and in that moment, it feels like her life is shattered. She's allowed to spend 15 minutes with him to say goodbye. She has to take the children in one by one to see their father for the last time, leaving the other 3 in the car park with her sister. The night he dies, she goes home to an empty house with her 4 children and her sister, and they order a takeout. No visitors, no hugs, no stories of comfort, no friends at the funeral. This is what COVID funerals look like. At first, she's accepting of the situation, the global pandemic, lockdown, everybody's doing their bit. But now she goes on to tell me she's furious. Furious for what they missed out on. Furious for how he died alone. Furious for all the memories of those weeks that her children will never have. And so much guilt and regret. Her life has changed irrevocably and is unrecognizable to her. Understandably, she feels totally overwhelmed. She seeks out counseling early on, and her account of the therapeutic experience is one I hear over and over and over again. The therapist is very nice, but he just doesn't know what to do with me and my distress. He just doesn't get it. Nobody understands what I'm going through. Hers is just one story of loss out of the 60,000 plus deaths that have happened in Ireland over the last 2 years. 60,000 deaths and approximately 600,000 bereaved people. And these are statistics from the Irish Hospice Foundation, where we know about 29,000 people die every year, and slightly more than that during the pandemic. A recurring theme that comes from guests on the podcast and listeners of the podcast is that they find it really difficult to find a counsellor or a psychotherapist who really gets their experience of grief. We do need more ordinary people to understand grief and all of its nuances. And we also need our healthcare workers and mental health providers to become grief trained or grief educated if they're going to support people who are grieving. Preliminary research that I've undertaken has given me some interesting data. Newly qualified counsellors and psychotherapists have had little to no grief education as part of their undergraduate training. Newly qualified counsellors and psychotherapists feel neither comfortable nor competent enough to work with people who are bereaved. And counsellors and psychotherapists who have had several years clinical experience believe that they have the competencies to adequately support people through grief despite no training. So why is this? The answer might be in the Dunning-Kruger effect. We've all seen this in action over the last 2 years. A person reads an article about COVID-19 and suddenly they are an expert immunologist. The same people a few months later are now experts on foreign policy in Russia. So Dunning-Kruger found this phenomenon that exists. The less experience we have in a particular subject, the more confidence we seem to have in that area. So what is this weird paradox, I hear you ask? Well, as we learn more, we ironically become less confident because we realize that as we learn more, the more we don't know. As we continue to learn and become expert in our fields, only then does our confidence begin to rise again. Many of us, in fairness, are guilty of being armchair experts with one thing or another. But we can't afford to be armchair experts if we're professionals working with the bereaved or people who are grieving. As Katherine said, people deserve more. They deserve a properly trained and educated counsellor or psychotherapist. Another little survey that I did showed me that 100% of the psychotherapists and supervisors that I surveyed advertise bereavement as something that they support in their practice. Yet none of them felt that they had enough training in the area. None of them had ever heard of ambiguous loss, disenfranchised grief, anticipatory grief, or grieving styles. 80% of the participants had never heard of the dual process model, tasks of mourning, or continuing bonds. These are the theories we work with nowadays. We don't work with stages of grief. 90% of participants believed that people do go through defined stages of grief. This is a myth that we've long since proven that it just doesn't work that way. Grief is not linear. It doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's cyclical. It can be constant. Grief is definitely cannot be reduced to a stages theory. So one colleague of mine that I interviewed and surveyed told me that she felt really comfortable working with people who are bereaved, but she'd do my survey to help out my research. She's a psychotherapist in private practice for over 15 years, and she knows I'm sharing this tonight. So I asked her to complete just 4 hours of the Shapes of Grief program, and here's what she said. She said, "Gosh, Liz, I really thought I understood grief. I thought I wouldn't learn anything new. I now realise that I was actually quite clueless. It's shocked me, to be honest, how much I didn't know that I didn't know." So I challenge everyone here this evening and listening tonight to really ask yourself, could there be more to learn? Could there be a whole body of information out there that I just haven't accessed yet? It's really worth looking into. The danger of an ill-informed mental health practitioner is that they may exacerbate the grief experience or may lead those seeking support to believe that therapy doesn't work, depriving them of perhaps much-needed support. The Shapes of Grief training program is one solution that addresses the deficit of grief training among our healthcare professionals. Another amazing solution, of course, is the Masters in Bereavement Studies with the Irish Hospice Foundation, which started me on my journey, and I also teach there nowadays. So the Shapes of Grief training program provides 40 hours of targeted grief education delivered by 26 global specialists. It's divided into 4 modules: theories and models of grief, types of loss, perspectives of grief and loss, and grief in clinical practice. It can be done online, in your own time, and at your own pace. And so many people actually who have listened to the podcast as bereaved people have gone on to do the training program. There's one woman, Sandy Adams, who's going to be next week's podcast episode. She's an American woman living in Australia, had a sudden loss, found it hard to find something that resonated with her, and she came across the Shapes of Grief podcast, listened, loved it, went on to do the grief education program, and now she's studying to be a psychotherapist at the age of 62, and she wants to specialise in grief and loss. That's just one story. There's several of them out there, which is wonderful. Our vision is to help nurture a grief-literate society and to help professionals to be grief-trained through the Shapes of Grief podcast and the Shapes of Grief training program. And I say help because there's so many people, like I said earlier, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. There are so many people, many are in the room here today from the Irish Hospice Foundation, There's many of us approaching this from different angles. There's people who've done it for many more years than I have, but I'm just one possible solution out there that's maybe accessible, affordable, and you can do it in your own time. So how can you help? Share the resources. These are just some of the guests that I've had on the podcast. Many of you are here tonight, actually. Linda's here, Nicola's here, Katrine and Wendelene have come over from the UK. Catherine is here, Susan Delaney is here, Kathleen Keys, Ruth Fitz Morris. They've all been on the podcast, and many, many more people here today. I think we've done 86 episodes now, and it's been listened to over 140,000 times. So that's quite phenomenal. So share the podcast episodes. Like us on Facebook. Write a review. If everyone here listening actually wrote a review on Apple Podcasts, it would sort of bump us up the rankings. And then when people are looking for this resource, they'll find it. So please don't assume that everyone else is going to do it and you don't have to. I really plead with you to take 5 minutes and write a little review and rate it. Share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter, Instagram, and keep sharing. We need to keep spreading the word. I've already taken you through Shapes of Grief, so do the training program. It's very accessible, €199 for 40 hours of really targeted grief training. There's the 4 modules. And if you'd like to become a sponsor, I would really like to talk to you. At the end of the day, I'm a single mum with 4 kids, and I'm doing this in my spare time. I would really love some financial support to keep us going. This is done, like I said, in my own time, and it would be really wonderful to have some more hands on the back, helping financially if that's at all possible. You can become a sponsor, email me, we'll have a chat, or go to patreon.com/Shapes of Grief. And you could pledge, a tenner a month just to keep the podcast going. And like I said, please like, share, follow, rate, review, all of that. Okay, so that's just the summary of my request to you this evening. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to end with just one more little passage to reflect on what we've heard here tonight. So following the experience of loss, we often have an immense hunger for connections that have both emotional and psychological depth. Small talk becomes impossible. We search for the emotional maps that will teach us how to navigate the landscapes of our own selves, often now unrecognizable to us, looking for someone to become a Sherpa to our grief. But in a death-denying society, it can be hard to find ordinary people who are willing to bear the depths of our grief alongside us. And this is why we sometimes need to turn to professionals. In an ideal world, we would get what we needed from the community, from our friends, from our families. We Google bereavement counselling, but all too often, our therapists also come from the same death-denying, grief-avoidant communities that we do. They too offer empty rhetoric or alienating sympathy, which only serves to further isolate the griever. Rarely are we more alive and present than when we are experiencing the depths of grief. It's often our resistance to grief that causes us profound suffering. Us humans have traditionally expressed grief as an integral part of life. It's only in recent modern Western culture that we've shunned grief to the shadows of our experience. It doesn't fit with what our sanitized version says we ought to look like. We honor and applaud strength, power, achievement, and ambition. These are not bedfellows of grief. The grieving soul is likely to be on their knees, vulnerable, feeling powerless, and maybe devoid of a sense of meaning and purpose, for a time at least. Paradoxically, it takes enormous courage to allow ourselves to feel this emotional pain, and we urgently need to welcome those who grieve back to the community, where together we can carry our personal and collective grief, not in the shadows, but in the light. Thank you so much for your presence here this evening, whether you're online or here in person. And thank you for your ongoing support for Shapes of Grief. I'm going to ask Bronwyn to come back to the stage now to close us out. Mind yourselves.
I just want to say that I'm really grateful to have been here tonight, and I feel really honoured to have heard all the beautiful testimonies and skills that people have offered tonight, so thank you very much. This is a song, it's an old Appalachian song called The Blackest Crow, which Liz has illustrated lovely here. And yeah, it helped me move some grief. So as time draws near, my dearest dear,